The mainland of Southeast Asia, historically known as Indochina, is home to a wide range of ethnicities that extend across a vast territory. Spread interchangeably are forests, mountains, valleys, rivers, deltas, and coastlines. With such a divergent environment, the nations of Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam have distinctly different identities, beliefs, and geopolitical needs. I'm your host Shirvan, and welcome to Caspian Report. Stretching from the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayan foothills give Indochina a geography that is distinct from the rest of continental Asia. This terrain hosts such a dense tropical vegetation that it's practically inhospitable for humans. Moreover, due to the impenetrable landscape, cartographers cannot exactly draw a straight line through the jungle and call it a border. As a result, the delineation of the borders between the regional nations is somewhat ambiguous and therefore contested. The central governments of Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are all concentrated on patchworks of arable land where rivers, deltas, and valleys traverse. However, the pockets of human settlements in the borderlands are isolated from their respective heartlands. More importantly, the borderlands are populated by ethnic minorities that do not necessarily abide by the rules of the central governments. These large, ungoverned swaths of land are predisposed to illegal activities and separatist attitudes. Such are the complications of Indochina. Historically, the lack of authority over the borderlands allowed foreign powers to exploit these elements at the expense of the feudal rulers. Ultimately, this is what allowed the Europeans to colonize the area, and it's also what enabled the Japanese and Allied forces to advance into the region during World War II. As technology improved, the Americans and the Soviets turned the separatist militias into well-armed proxies, which they used against one another. This history of foreign exploitation has left a deep, lasting impression on the local people. Yet, despite their common legacy, the regional nations also remain distrustful of each other as they still cope with artificial borders and unsettled civil conflicts. So the lack of complete authority aggravates frictions from within and without. This regional division also hampers the economic potential of the area. According to the Asian Development Bank, the economies in mainland Southeast Asia need to allocate at least 5.7% of their GDPs towards integrated infrastructure projects through 2030 to unlock their trade potential. Yet with the situation on the ground, even if the funds were available, there is little political will for regional integration. This also explains why political and economic integration through the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has been such an incremental process. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar are all preoccupied with the consolidation of power and remain reluctant to forge better relations with each other. Perhaps the best evidence of the regional division can be witnessed by the individual agreements with China. For instance, the upstream control of the Mekong River, which runs from the Tibetan Plateau in China to Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, grants the government in Beijing significant leverage over the economies of the downstream nations. Although the Mekong River is difficult to navigate, it remains an important supply line for small vessels between West China and Southeast Asia. The Chinese trade activity is particularly noticeable in Laos and Cambodia. Despite their shared geopolitical vulnerability, the downstream nations have negotiated bilateral agreements with China over the management of the Mekong's resources. These individual talks give Beijing the ability to negotiate from a position of strength, because the Chinese can always play off the downstream countries against each other and extract maximum concessions. Overall, the unyielding geography of mainland Southeast Asia that is invested with conflict and exploited by foreign powers means that long-lasting stability and peace is an elusive concept. Yet some nations benefit from this arrangement more than others. For instance, the Kingdom of Thailand, which sits at the nexus of mainland Southeast Asia, has the potential to emerge as a regional power. Its heartland, located around the rich lowlands of the Chao Phraya River basin, enabled the Thai rulers to form a strong, unified ethnic and economic base. Its largest city, Bangkok, is one of the most centralized capitals in the region. This seat of power is protected by mountains to the north and the Korat Plateau to the northeast, while the Tenasserim Hills deflect neighboring Myanmar from encroachment. Thailand's primary geographic vulnerability comes from Cambodia to the east, but the two states have an understanding that involves Vietnam. In the past, Thailand's vast agricultural output and its position in between the Andaman Sea and the South China Sea was the focus of contention among European powers. Regardless, the country was never fully colonized, neither by the Europeans nor by the regional kingdoms on its flanks. Thailand's ability to deflect international and regional powers is a point of enormous national pride to this day. Since the 19th century, the Thai rulers have maintained a loose alliance with the Americans. This arrangement was briefly disrupted during World War II, when Thailand declared war on the United States and the British Empire at the behest of the Japanese invasion. However, the Thai government rotated back to the west soon after the conflict. In fact, during the Cold War, Thailand served as a geopolitical counterweight to the spread of communism elsewhere in the area. Today, Bangkok maintains an alliance with Washington, while its economy, which is mostly dominated by the industrial and manufacturing sectors, maintains deep ties with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. What's more is that since Thailand shares no border with China, the government in Bangkok is less fearful of Beijing and embraces Chinese investments as a result. This complex web of security and financial partners illustrates that Thai policymakers seek to reduce their dependency on a single ally and prefer to keep their options open. Located on the easternmost edge of Indochina is Vietnam. Foreign policy-wise, it is one of the toughest countries imaginable. Having decisively won an armed conflict against the Chinese, the French, and the Americans, the Vietnamese geopolitical mindset is shaped by its confidence and determination to maintain their painstakingly won independence. As a result, Vietnam has invested fiercely in its armed forces, which remarkably stands its ground against the Chinese. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam has a coastline that extends for more than 3,200 kilometers and is adjacent to the Gulf of Tonkin, the South China Sea, and the Gulf of Thailand. However, Vietnam's narrow and long territory essentially splits its heartland in two. To the north lies the capital Hanoi, which sits by the Red River, while the city of Saigon sits in the south by the Mekong River basin. These two heartlands are at a distance of about 2,500 kilometers and find themselves separated by a thin, rugged patch of land in the center, which at its narrowest crossing is only 50 kilometers wide. This is Vietnam's Achilles heel. Aggravating Vietnam's predicament is the fact that Hanoi and Saigon are divided along cultural, social, and political fault lines. This division leaves the country vulnerable to foreign exploitation. Historically, the Vietnamese dealt with their dilemma by expanding along the Mekong River into neighboring Laos and Cambodia to create some buffer space. Today, the notion to expand the buffer zone at the expense of its western neighbors remains a geopolitical objective for policymakers in Hanoi. However, in recent years, Beijing's maritime claims in the South China Sea has raised concerns in the Vietnamese capital. The closer China encroaches on Vietnamese waters, the less secure the link between Hanoi and Saigon becomes. Thus far, Vietnam's military capabilities have discouraged the Chinese from taking forceful measures. But policymakers in Hanoi are coming to the realization that they need allies to contain the geopolitical advances of Beijing. And the Vietnamese are looking to their Russian, Indian, Japanese, and even American counterparts for aid. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Cambodia is doing the opposite. As a small nation between Vietnam and Thailand, Cambodia has a complex relationship with its neighbors due to its violent past. A century of non-ending conflict which saw European colonization, an American bombing campaign, and the rise of the Khmer Rouge, nearly annihilated Cambodia from existence. Ironically, the country was rescued by its nemesis Vietnam when they invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge from power. Even now, after decades of somewhat stability, Cambodia is still recovering from its past. However, the reconstruction process has been slow because the country lacks any form of wealth. In fact, Cambodia is recklessly dependent on foreign aid, and its economy mostly revolves around low-cost manufacturing. With a GDP per capita that is comparable to landlocked Zambia in South Central Africa, Cambodia is the poorest nation in the region. Due to this desperation, Cambodia completely embraces China. At least 26% of its total trade goes by China, and in the past decade, large sums of Chinese investments have channeled into the capital Phnom Penh as well as into the pockets of top officials. In exchange, Cambodia rejects the West and prevents the ASEAN member states from forming a collective position on China. Considering the poor position of Cambodia, its policymakers believe they have no choice but to continue their patron-client relationship with China. To the north sits Laos. It's the only landlocked state in Southeast Asia, and most of its landscape consists of thick forests and rugged mountains. As a result, the country has very few areas that can sustain large population centers. This explains why Laos has a population of only 6.7 million people, which is remarkably small when compared to its neighbors. What's more is that the central government has no real control over the countryside. It also lacks the funds to invest in infrastructure to unify the nation. This insecurity, in combination with the rugged terrain, has enabled separatist factions from staking claims on the remote outskirts of the country. In addition, Laos finds itself wedged between three larger neighbors and fears becoming a battleground for other powers. During the proxy conflicts of the Cold War, the United States dropped more bombs on Laos than on Japan and Germany during World War II. Understandably, policymakers in the capital Vientiane are not keen on cooperation with the West. Instead, Laos has turned to China. Much like Cambodia, trade along the Mekong River dominates the economic life in Laos. Nearly 27% of its total trade is conducted with China, which is the highest percentage in all of Southeast Asia. Additionally, Beijing is constructing a high-speed railway across Laos, which includes 75 tunnels and 167 bridges. The government in Vientiane claims to follow a policy of neutrality, yet in practice, Laos is steadily turning into a Chinese client state like Cambodia. The final contender in Indochina is the Republic of the Union of Myanmar. The Irrawaddy River, which flows from the north to the south before emptying into the Andaman Sea, is not just Myanmar's primary commercial waterway, but its drainage basin forms the heartland of the country. The central location of the capital Naypyidaw allows the government to skillfully exercise its power over the basin. Yet not all of Myanmar is this secure. The mountainous borderlands, although they provide some security for the heartland, are inhabited by ethnic minorities who largely reject the central government. With at least a dozen active separatist factions, Myanmar is rife with conflict, and the government has never succeeded in consolidating full control over the countryside, so it's not surprising that in the past, the military rulers in Naypyidaw isolated the country from the outside world. Myanmar has only recently started to open up after decades of international isolation. However, as the military faction loosens its grip on power, the liberalization process has intensified internal, ethnic, and religious tensions in the country. The most evident example is the ongoing ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya people. Such frictions expose Myanmar to overt and covert foreign intervention, and given Myanmar's close cooperation with China on pipelines, ports, and railway networks, which are designed for China's bypassing of the Strait of Malacca, there are plentiful reasons for outside powers to exploit Naypyidao's standoff with ethnic minorities. In this sense, Myanmar is one of the most exposed countries in Southeast Asia. It faces threats within and without. Overall, the nations in mainland Southeast Asia are all unique and have their own distinct needs. Some are desperate and embrace foreign patronage, while others are determined to stand their ground regardless of the odds. It is this divergence that solidifies the region's division and allows regional and global powers to reshape their geopolitical trajectories. To the east is maritime Southeast Asia, which is a cluster of small and large islands that sit between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Historically part of the East Indies, and contemporarily known as the Malay Archipelago, the area has some of the world's highest levels of biodiversity for marine ecosystems. Here, coral, fish, and mollusks thrive. Yet, perhaps the prevailing characteristic is the maritime-based cultures that are represented by the nations of the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. All of this makes for a unique archipelagic neighborhood with its own distinct geopolitical needs. In its entirety, the Malay Archipelago exists of more than 25,000 islands, which range from large land masses such as Borneo, Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi, Mindanao, and Luzon to tiny dots on the map. The interior of these larger islands are covered by jungles and highlands, while the fertile coastlines host large-scale human settlements. In this environment, it's easier to travel by sea than by land. Most of the seas in the Malay Archipelago are shallow, warm, and somewhat free of salt when compared to other parts of the world. There are a few deep underwater trenches, but overall, these are optimal conditions for marine ecosystems. In addition, with the exception of the Philippines, most of maritime Southeast Asia is free of typhoons and hurricanes. There are, however, many active volcanoes in the area, and the islands are vulnerable to earthquake activity. Maritime Southeast Asia is also one of the most culturally diverse areas in the world. The 380 million people that live in the region belong to a wide range of ethnic and linguistic groups. The majority are descendants of the Austronesian people, whose explorations were driven by the monsoon winds. These wind systems, which blow frequently from the northwest and then reverse to blow from the southeast, enabled travelers, merchants, and missionaries from distant lands to arrive and leave at regular intervals. In time, this encouraged the exchange of foreign ideas. The Hindu statecraft and Confucian philosophy were some of the early foreign concepts that played a decisive role in the shaping of the kingdoms between the 5th and 15th century. By the 10th century, Muslim traders from the Arabian Peninsula introduced Islam to the region, which became the dominant faith by the 16th century. The remote areas, however, particularly in Polynesia, were largely unaffected by the cultural trade and retained their indigenous cultures. Still others were acquainted with Christianity when they made contact with the European explorers. All this cultural diversity makes for a unique scope of the surface, but from a geopolitical angle, it is also a barrier to national unity and a backdoor to foreign intervention. The truth is that many of the local governments in the Malay Archipelago lack political authority over their domains. This reality is rooted in history. In the 19th century, the European colonial powers strengthened the ethnic groups living in the borderlands to subvert the central feudal rulers. This trend continued during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union armed regional rebels to fight the central governments. A century of divide and conquer has instilled a legacy of rebellion that has persisted to this day. The ethno-linguistic groups that populate the remote borderlands and islands often feel no sense of loyalty to their central governments. Another striking trend in the Malay Archipelago is that most nations lack capable navies, despite being in a predominantly maritime area. the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia spend about 1% of their GDPs on defense. That is not enough, but it ties in with the fact that the countries are beset with separatist groups. As such, the governments are forced to prioritize the conventional army and air force over the development of the navy. This decision is not an easy one, but necessary nonetheless if the separatist rebellions are to be contained. In general, maritime Southeast Asia is an unforgiving region, but some states are better positioned than others. As a nation with more than 17,000 islands, Indonesia is the embodiment of Southeast Asia's potential and shortcomings. The country sits at the nexus of global trade, where the Indian Ocean meets the South China Sea and the Pacific. It has the world's fourth largest population and the single largest in the Muslim world. Indonesia also has an abundance of natural resources and an impressive manufacturing sector. It is projected that the country will emerge as the fourth largest economy in the world by 2050. In other words, the Republic of Indonesia is a sleeping giant. Yet Indonesia is also an enormous country, perhaps too big for its own good. The distance from end to end equals to that between Paris and Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. The heartland of Indonesia, located in Java, ranks as the most populous island and is home to 145 million people, or about 55% of the total population. Java is also Indonesia's agricultural heartland and sits by the Java Sea, which links to the South China Sea and the Karimata Strait, to the Makassar Strait, the Flores Sea, and the Banda Sea. These seas connect the Java heartland to the other main regions, Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and Western New Guinea. The capital, Jakarta, dominates the political landscape of the country, but Indonesia has no singular ethnic, linguistic, cultural, or religious identity. Instead, there are over 300 ethno-linguistic groups. As such, Jakarta, which is dominated by the ethnic Javanese, has never managed to exercise complete control over the entire nation. Maintaining political unity is therefore Indonesia's primary geopolitical objective and shapes the country's strong centralized government. But the pursuit of this objective has also upset many indigenous populations in the borderlands. As a result, the Jakarta government is currently dealing with 7 distinct separatist groups, ranging from Aceh on the northern tip of Sumatra to West Papua, which sits at a distance of some 3,000 kilometers east of Java. Moreover, most of the rebellion hotspots are in areas that are rugged, underdeveloped, and covered in jungle. In 1999, Jakarta lost control over East Timor altogether, which illustrates just how difficult it is to maintain political unity. But what makes it even worse is Indonesia's long coastline. With more than 50,000 kilometers of coastline, Jakarta cannot sustain a coast guard capable enough to fully patrol such a vast area. This means that the government does not have complete control over its territorial integrity, and therefore cannot defend itself from foreign powers. Taken together, the ethno-linguistic tensions and the lack of control over the coastlines constitute as Indonesia's primary vulnerabilities. For this reason, Jakarta does whatever it can to avoid picking a side in its immediate environment. The government essentially wants to be left alone and wants to discourage foreign powers from exploiting its internal divisions. All this explains the dormancy of Indonesian policymakers and why the country is unlikely to adjust its passive geopolitical policy. To the north lies the Philippines, a nation of contrast. Luzon Island, which includes the capital Manila, is highly urbanized and boasts a sophisticated society that numbers around 57 million people. However, Luzon is one of the 3 primary clusters of the country. The other 2 include the island groups of Visayas and Mindanao, which host 19 million and 25 million people respectively. Taken together, the 3 island chains consist of more than 7,000 islands and nearly 200 ethnicities. Luzon in the north forms the Filipino heartland, but the further south one travels, the poorer the living conditions get and the weaker the central authority is. Due to these social, economic, and cultural divisions, maintaining political union is Manila's primary task. In addition to the internal considerations, as a former de facto colony of Spain and the United States, the Philippines has historically acted as a gateway between continental East Asia and Western powers. That geopolitical legacy is reflected in the modern power struggle in maritime Southeast Asia. China's surge in the region has driven Beijing to forge an alliance with Manila, preferably a Patreon-client relationship which would allow the Chinese to bypass the strategic choke points that run from Indonesia to Japan. At the same time, the Americans want to contain China within those lines by maintaining the current alliance with the Philippines. This stalemate essentially leaves Filipino policymakers with two options. They can either acknowledge China's sphere of influence and operate at the behest of Beijing, or they can continue to rely on the support of the global naval power whose homeland is more than 11,000 kilometers away and whose commitment has proven to be dubious. So neither option is particularly great. In recent years, however, due to the efforts of President Duterte, Manila has sought to find a balance between the two powers by improving its economic relationship with China while reducing its security arrangement with the United States. The Filipino government is so fixated on maintaining political union that it doesn't have the strength to stand up against Chinese and American advances. Yet by playing the two powers against each other, Manila hopes to enforce its own foreign policy. Far away from the great political games is the nation of Brunei, which occupies a small segment on the northern coast of Borneo. In geopolitics, the seclusion of Brunei has given the country the time to develop itself, and with a GDP per capita of $78,000, the country has a lot to show for. However, Brunei's prosperity depends on the export of hydrocarbon resources, which are expected to run out in the next 2 decades, so the country will have to completely overhaul its economy if it wants to maintain its wealth. Yet Brunei is too isolated to compete in high-value sectors and too rich to compete in low-value sectors. These conditions discourage Western investments in the country. The only outside power that has stepped up is Beijing. Chinese state companies are aiding the government of Brunei in the development of its industrial sector and the upgrade of its infrastructure. In exchange for this economic aid, Brunei is looking the other way when it comes to Beijing's encroachment in the South China Sea. In the long term, this will inevitably strengthen China's foothold in the area, but Brunei has no one else to turn to. Meanwhile, on the other side of the sea, in Singapore, things are looking better. Located at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, Singapore sits between the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait. This strategic position has allowed the city-state to emerge as a global hub for shipping and banking. What is less known is that Singapore has also acquired some of the best military equipment available and integrated complex weapon systems cohesively thanks to the efforts of Western allies. As a result, Singapore has one of the finest naval and air forces in maritime Southeast Asia. All these elements allow the city-state to punch well above its weight on the geopolitical level. However, Singapore also has significant vulnerabilities. Most obviously, its small size deprives the country of strategic depth, meaning the city-state has nothing to fall back on, and it could lose everything in a single stroke. The risk of blowback is so great that Singapore does whatever it can to avoid upsetting the larger powers. As such, Singapore has surprisingly favorable economic relations with regional and global powers. However, in the past decade, due to Beijing's increasing activities in the South China Sea, Policymakers in Singapore are worried that geopolitical tensions will affect the local maritime traffic. To prepare itself for such a scenario, Singapore has expressed a willingness to team up with the Americans. Already, the country hosts rotating deployments of US warships, and military ties between Singapore and Washington are improving across the board. If this trend continues, Singapore could break from tradition and join the coalition against China in the near future. The final actor in maritime Southeast Asia is Malaysia, which is technically also part of mainland Asia, but its national interests are more in line with the archipelagic group. Malaysia's geopolitical value stems from its proximity to the world's busiest sea lanes. The fragmented geography of the country, which is split between Malaysian Borneo and Peninsular Malaysia, acts as an important check on the seaborne trade that transits through the Malacca Strait. More precisely, the western coastline from Johor Bahru to Penang in Peninsular Malaysia is essential to secure the free flow of trade through the Malacca Strait. This coastline also happens to be the industrial and political heartland of the country, where the capital Kuala Lumpur is located. Malaysia's Indian and Chinese communities, which account for about 30% of the total population, are also situated in the heartland. Malaysian Borneo makes up roughly 60% of the country's landmass, but only hosts 20% of the total population. Here, the extraction of hydrocarbon resources plays an increasingly important role in the economy of the country. However, to secure its long and complicated coastlines, Kuala Lumpur maintains an alliance with Washington. Having said that, Malaysia also plays a critical role in the Chinese designs for Southeast Asia. This is highlighted by Beijing's selective investments in the country. Now, ordinarily, foreign investment is an objective for most countries. In Malaysia, however, Chinese investments have acted as a source of friction. More precisely, Beijing fully understands the polarized nature of Southeast Asia, and in Malaysia, China exploits the peculiar post-colonial borders and the deep ethnic tensions within those territories by promoting regional economic disparities. For instance, Beijing will invest funds in one area with the aim to drift that particular region away from Kuala Lumpur, while at the same time stimulating economic disparity. It's essentially Beijing's way of divide and conquer. Today, the central government of Malaysia maintains a firm hold over its territories. However, should Kuala Lumpur ever fall into political instability, the semi-autonomous regions of Malaysia would be exposed to foreign intervention. As such, maintaining political stability and unity while being vigilant with foreign investments is the primary objective for Malaysian policymakers. Now, more than ever, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei need to forge multilateral frameworks for military, political and economic cooperation, as is envisioned by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Each state also needs to find ways to maintain political unity while bolstering their naval capabilities. This is a region where land divides and sea unites. Having a capable navy is not a choice, but a geopolitical necessity if one is to survive. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our contributors on Patreon who give us the means to research and produce content like this. If you're seeking for additional perks such as early access, PDF reports, etc., or if you simply want to support our channel, consider joining our community on patreon.com/CaspianReport. All the funds help to keep us independent and self-sustained. For now, thank you for your time and Sarol.